The story of the 38th parallel and how it divided two of the most notable nations on Earth today is deep-rooted in the rivalry between two different political ideologies, communism and capitalism. The Korean Peninsula was once a unified territory for almost 500 years, under the rule of dynasties such as the Joseon and Goryeo. The beginning of the 20th century saw the rise of the first Asian power, Japan. Having defeated Tsarist Russia in the early years of 1900, Japan annexed the Korean Peninsula in 1910, only to relinquish it after the brutal defeat at the hands of the Allied powers. To understand the South and North divide, it is essential to trace back what essentially happened after the defeat of Japan and at the Yalta Conference post-victory and how it led to two nations being created as the first collaterals of the Cold War. End of an empire. On 10 August 1945, the day after the atom bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, American officials worked late into the night at the State Department. With Japan on the brink of surrender, it was necessary to agree upon a future Asian policy. For several centuries, Korea had been an independent, unified nation, but early in the 20th century, it had been overrun by an expansionist Japan. The occupation had been bitterly resented by most Koreans, who now hoped that Japan's imminent defeat would bring an end to it, leading once more to an independent Korea. With World War II ended, the United States urgently reassessed its future interest in Asia and rapidly came to a decision. America must share with the USSR the occupation of Korea at the end of the war. With no appropriate natural division to the Korean Peninsula, the 38th parallel, which roughly divided the country in half, was proposed to the Kremlin. However risky this policy, the Kremlin agreed to divide Korea along this artificial boundary and halted the Red Army when it was reached. In early September 1945, U.S. soldiers landed in Korea at Incheon and entered Seoul, the capital. The U.S. doctrine, inheriting a political vacuum that stemmed from the war's sudden end, the U.S. occupation force, commanded by General John Hodge, was brought face-to-face with Korean politics when rival groups identified themselves as representing the new Korean government. Hodge turned instead to former Japanese officials to help him run the country. The Koreans were deeply offended that their new occupiers should line up with the hated Japanese. Slowly, the Japanese administrators were expelled from Korea, and the U.S. military had to turn to a variety of collaborators in maintaining law and order. Prominent nationalists and members of the anti-Japanese resistance had formed a provisional government, but at least half of them were communists. This faction looked to one of Korea's most famous exiles as leader. His name was Syngman Rhee. Rhee had several assets as far as the United States was concerned. He was not tainted by collaboration with the Japanese. He was strongly anti-communist. And with his perfect English, he seemed a more comfortable figure to American soldiers and diplomats than most other Korean politicians. Rhee emerged in the winter of 1945 as the U.S. nominee for political control over South Korea. Although Rhee appealed to the American generals, his natural power base in Korea was small. He had to rely upon officials who, having worked with the Japanese, were discredited in the eyes of most Koreans. Ambitious for power and wealth, he became corrupt and ruthless. The Communists assemble. North of the 38th parallel, under Soviet guidance and supervision, a network of people's committees was formed. In February 1947, these committees met in Pyongyang, the northern capital, and established the People's Assembly of North Korea. Kim Il-sung, another Korean exile, was elected its chairman. Kim had opposed the Japanese occupation during the 1930s and had gone to the Soviet Union during the war. By 1945, he was leading a Korean unit in the Red Army. Between 1945 and 1947, the situation in Korea polarized as the two power blocs, North and South, became more secure. Both sides constantly expressed their desire for national unity, but in practice, reunification became a more and more remote goal. With inflation, poverty, and distress came civil disturbances. In the North, there were public show trials of opponents of the regime. In January 1948, the United Nations called for free elections in both North and South Korea. The Soviet Union rejected any UN involvement, and elections eventually went ahead only in the South. Amid mounting repression, and with the communists boycotting the polls, Rai and his right-wing supporters won a majority of seats in Korea's new constitutional assembly. In August, Rai was inaugurated president of the new Republic of Korea. A month later, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was proclaimed in Pyongyang. Korean War begins. Kim Il-sung repeatedly asked for permission from Stalin to launch an attack on South Korea to reunite the Korean Peninsula under the red flag. But Stalin resisted this idea, doubtful of the U.S. response. Despite several further requests by Kim, Stalin again concluded in September 1949 that the risks of American intervention were too great, and he once more vetoed an invasion. In April 1950, Kim went secretly to visit Stalin in the Kremlin. The Chinese were informed of Stalin's green light for invasion and also extended their support to North Korea. By the spring of 1950, large numbers of tanks, cannons, machine guns, and planes had been delivered to North Korea. Kim Il-sung moves south. Stalin gave his final go-ahead but maintained a tight rein over the North Koreans by even dictating the date of the invasion. 25th June 1950. Early on the morning of 25th June, on the pretext of responding to an armed incursion from the south, the North Korean People's Army attacked. Following a dawn artillery barrage, 7 combat-ready divisions advanced south across the 38th parallel, behind a line of giant Russian T-34 tanks. The attack achieved complete surprise. The Soviet Union had walked out of the Security Council in January to protest the UN decision not to admit Communist China, and it was still boycotting the Council in June. Under these extraordinary circumstances, the Security Council unanimously condemned North Korea's aggression and called for a withdrawal to the 38th parallel. The UN went even further by calling on all member states to extend military aid to South Korea. With the Soviets absent from the Security Council, the UN voted for the first time to send a military force to assist one country attacked by another. Over the next decades, there would be other blatant acts of aggression, but not until the 1991 Gulf War would the UN again engage itself militarily on one side of a conflict. It was under the banner of UN legitimacy that the United States, Britain, Australia, Turkey, and the other Western allies fought the war in Korea. USA enters Asia. Kim and Stalin had miscalculated. They never imagined that America would choose to fight over such a distant land, nor did they foresee the speed of the West's response. For Syngman Rhee, whose corrupt regime had been on the brink of collapse, the war provided the moral legitimacy of a UN resolution and multinational backing for his government. The military tide turned rapidly in favor of the UN-US, and the troops marched inland from Incheon. Their first objective was the liberation of Seoul. Resistance was heavy, the city was devastated, and at least 50,000 civilians were killed in the crossfire. Watching events from the Kremlin, Stalin was furious. He withdrew most of his military advisors and told Kim Il-sung to make evacuation plans. To the United Nations forces, it looked as though the war would soon be over. Conquering North Korea. When the UN troops reached the 38th parallel, a difficult decision presented itself. The invaders had been expelled from the territory invaded, but Rhee, burning to reunite Korea, had no doubt that reoccupying the South was only the first step. South Korean troops crossed the line and entered North Korea. The UN established a commission for the reunification and rehabilitation of Korea, which added to the ambiguity of the UN's role there. On that same day, US troops crossed the 38th parallel and advanced into communist territory. Chinese infiltration. The Chinese also were annoyed with their North Korean allies. More than once, Mao Zedong expressed his willingness to send Chinese troops to aid their North Korean brothers. Stalin, still determined to keep the Soviet Union, rescued the North Korean regime. Meanwhile, Pyongyang fell to a combined force of UN and South Korean troops, the only communist capital ever to fall to the West in the Cold War. In the cold winter of 1950-51, China decided to finally intervene in the conflict. The Chinese People's Volunteers proved brutal, and the UN forces were thrown into a rout. America's worst nightmare had come, a full-scale war with China, with thoughts of even using the atomic bomb. The horrors of war. By late 1951, the Korean War had turned into a brutal stalemate. Both North Korean and UN forces were locked in fierce battles while advanced jet fighters fought in the skies. The US bombed North Korea relentlessly, dropping over 600,000 tons of bombs, pushing its people and industries underground. Meanwhile, Soviet support came at a high price. Stalin made China pay hard cash for weapons, even as Chinese troops died by the thousands. Peace talks began in 1951 at Panmunjom, but dragged on for over 18 months, mainly due to disputes over borders and prisoners of war. On the island of Kojé-do, communist POWs violently resisted UN efforts to screen who wanted to return to the north. The armistice. In 1952, Dwight Eisenhower was elected U.S. president and promised to end the Korean War. In 1953, Stalin's sudden death pushed Soviet and Chinese leaders to agree. It was time for peace. Eisenhower even threatened nuclear attacks to pressure China, while U.S. bombers destroyed dams in North Korea, causing massive floods. South Korea's leader, Syngman Rhee, tried to stop the peace by releasing communist prisoners. Still, on July 27, 1953, a ceasefire was signed. The war was over, but no peace treaty was ever signed. Tens of thousands of POWs were exchanged. Some communists returned home waving blood-stained flags. The human cost was massive. Over 1.5 million soldiers dead and millions of civilians displaced. North Korea never recovered, becoming isolated and poor under Kim Il-sung. Meanwhile, South Korea slowly grew into a booming economy. Ironically, the war helped Japan's economy explode thanks to billions in U.S. spending. Thus, in spite of years of conflict, negotiations, and painful separation, Korea is still divided. The superpowers might have established a boundary in the Korean War, may have entrenched it with bloodshed, but time has transformed that boundary into a great divide. Today, North and South Korea live completely different lives. In the South, you find liberty, fast internet, skyscrapers, and a trillion-dollar economy. In the North, strict regulations, control, poverty, and denial of rights. Two nations, one people, poles apart. Although the DMZ measures only 250 kilometers in length, it feels as if it's a universe away. Families separated in the 1950s still yearn for reconnection, even as younger generations grow up understanding only division. Nevertheless, the recollection of a previously unified Korea endures, in language, in historical legacy, and in the souls of those who long for peace. The Korean Peninsula serves as a strong reminder that political borders can alter lives for many generations. The Korean War serves as a reminder of how global hegemons can cause mass-scale disruptions to satisfy their own thirst for domination.